The function of defrauding the government, such as by an insurgent terrorist organization, such as those loyal to the Confederacy in their various phantom submerges, actively engage in the misuse of government equipment for the express purpose delegating the delay and defrauding of the American government, and thus the action of delaying the action of the government is not an action of the government, and thus the action of that sedition functions to the extent of undermining the government, qualifying it as an adversarial function in the sedition, as a punishable offense and not an official act that can be claimed a normal function of any of the various government offices, such as the presidency or the legislature, and thus the legislator claiming that their involvement in the thing, seeking as an insurgency by voter fraud, determines to themselves the function of engaging in the hate crimes by the extension of these functions, protecting the executive function by its covert action in the undermining and overthrowing of the government, makes at permanent the function of the legislator permanently muted, thus the extermination of the branch altogether by its collapse in their contracts with the devil as acts of treason, determinizes the centralizing of the powers exclusively to the executive, compromised by their nation against the American government or whatever government that they would be compromising. Engaging in that function is an act of treason, and thus the action is not a function of their office, and thus is subversive to the existence and longevity of the sovereign, which is not them. As they are not serving the law, they would not be functioning as the sovereign, and thus there would be no immunities. So their use of secrecy, such as the advancement of Confederate convenient policies, which are short of directly Confederate treason or usurpation, such as the need of the use of classification, engages in the function of undermining the purpose of law as it seeks to collapse the system by using the system against itself, and thus engaged in the censorship, blocking procedures so that it would not continue as an act of war against the government, using their insurgent theft of the equipment or agents in order to make sure that the government does not work properly, and thus have undermined its security and its ability to levy security against the protected rights and categories which would have been secured, including but not limited to the value of money. And thus the value of money in the United States is derived by the United States government's promise to defend and secure the monies or the debts owed. The good faith of the government to pay all of its debts is an obligation, and thus the function establishing the value of the central value of the money, which generates the American hegemony in its first world-class function as the international de facto currency. And to this extent, these systems undermining these types of activities in the widest variety of subjects systemically target each key aspect of society and its government in order to overthrow the sovereign for the anarchical white supremacist state, generating the systemic anarchical militias such as the lynch mobs, which would be restored as a de facto norm from the Confederacy to the modern day. To these arguments, the function, such as with William Barr and his negotiations for the development of the Confederacy in their insurrection operations, for the normal standards functions of criminal acts as profiteering mechanisms, such as their surveillance agreement for the racketeering systems, generates the perpetuity of the government equipment being used against the function of the government, and thus the action being that already engages in the function of the arguments for its particular agents who, believing falsely that they are underpaid, are then provided additional privileges as an assertion of nobility, as an extension generating a criminal position, as their special privileges are not legal, and thus the action of them as individuals from these advantages generates their actions of using the racketeering networks for their individual purpose without the function of their overlapping activities for the Confederate function in the criminal racketeering operations. And thus, the action from the federal government to this extent is obligated to have acted against them, but has been muted as the functions from David Bowles as intelligence oversight does not have his uh, branch of the military to have the military police enforce the law against their subversions as the obligation dictates, and thus is protected by the double agents derived by the voter fraud. Replacing the Congress generates the perpetuity of the offenses as a permanent criminal injury, collapsing the hegemony and long-standing values of the United States by specifically destroying the rights that they were as government to protect, which they as a double agent refuse to. And thus the function of Trey Gowdy's activities seeking the functions of using their enforcement mechanisms to violate some rights in order to protect other rights as a criminal act of treason becomes normalized in the subversion of the purpose of law in their overthrow of the government for perfect anarchy by their white supremacist communism, which has centrally planned the economy and its viable powers, which has increased their positions in their multi-pronged attack by their phantom selves to engage in the attack against the Second Amendment and other viable functions to stop the constitutional prescribed remedy to these insurrectionist functions, which then are obligated by virtue of them using secret government activities in order to destroy some rights, in order to pretend to protect other rights, engages in the increase of the available weapons owed to the American civilian population to defend, according to the Second Amendment, according to SCOTUS's arguments on its defamation of the Second Amendment, to have the accelerated equipment in order to oppose them, and thus the action having not been done engages in the perpetuity of their enforcement of their communism uh, by their subversive customs, which are not submitted to the court structures, and thus the function having undermined the government in every function is nothing but a cancerous infection by an enemy government. These to these ends you have the mechanism of the court receivers, which, if I am not mistaken, would be the courts ordering the remedy or reconstruction of a destroyed asset or company or system, and thus these being an obligation would rebuild those actively. And thus the function of subcontracted peoples to engage in the building and automating of those functions would be a compulsory function, and thus David's liberal friends who would have been in Congress and their supporters having won the estimate for the remedy to deal with the Confederates at the original position being wrong about the function because of their liberal bleeding hearts put themselves at a major disadvantage, but have, according to the record, finalized this dystopic disadvantage to themselves, which is not a burden for David or others, but is purely their problem, and thus the action of them using the receiver function for the reconstruction of David's system, such as the Confederate state, and its particulars, engages in an exponentially expensive function well beyond them as receivers, but them as legally contracted and liable to the function of the promotion, which is exponentially more difficult on the basis of how it is specifically set up, as the Confederates are engaged in pulling out the fingernails of those holding them, and thus are actively destroying and complicating the remedy of the less forceful solutions to them as an enemy of the United States. And David's liberal friends actively seeking alternatives to genocide or black sites or the such would need these systems to exist in order to satisfy their political agendas and their conceptions of what should be socially normal, which is their right to do. And thus the action of them having bound themselves to it is the legal answer from those parties, which I might remind you is exponentially more expensive to them than the simple remedy and the receivership functions, but is going to personally burden them, and they're going to, at some point, collapse their constitution concentration, and thus will try and get out of it. But they won't be allowed to get out of it. David will not release them from their contracted obligations. And it's going to make them miserable by virtue of just how diverse and stressful it is, but it is legally their burden to bear according to the common belief in the secret records. To be perfectly honest, David wishes them the best, but in those secret court functions has already won the argument time and time again on how it is not viable what they want to do, and thus fundamentally it is a decision of emotion over logic. And considering the function that the Confederates have systematically been attacking in order to create the possibility of the remedy to be less severe, since they're attacking that function, they are defining to the collective legal structure that it is beyond whatever they could possibly perceive under any extortionary thought to actively deserve under any stretch of law, and thus the mechanism of them making the remedy more difficult is their vote on the issue that they should be dealt with under the more harsh conditions. And thus, the action of what the liberals claim is not really going to be productive, as the very core identity of the Confederates will be subversive. Um, there's no version of them that is redeemable. They aren't functionally people anymore. There's no sane people on their side. They are white supremacist anarchists. They cannot be considered someone who thinks like a human being. They are not redeemable. That being said, they won the vote. To this extent, it's going to be exponentially more difficult to do what is functionally impossible. An act of futility. To stress and to struggle with the highest intentions, only to fail miserably. This is, reasonably speaking, the most likely outcome. The inconvenience of their misguided ambitions still serves as the threat that some Confederates might escape and be rearmed and engage in more military actions, similar to when they lost the first Civil War, and thus the action of them going back and starting their Klan activities again and doing their lynch mobs again. It is too viable a possibility to tolerate their existence that the amount of security needed in order to do that is itself going to consume exponentially amounts of their time and attention, and cannot be justified to not give it, and thus would be a permanent set obligation. and the permanent set obligation, similar to the function of maintaining a nuclear power site, is explanatory to when they fail those systems, which is the likely outcome, which is how Chernobyl happened, which is functionally what the estimate for the anarchists is. It's going to be the toxic hazard version of Chernobyl through the militia's activity. A disaster waiting to happen. Trying to de-radicalize and make non-psychopathic the anarchals, white supremacists, it's not functionally logical. To preserve the anarchists against the presumption of genocide being one of their key positions is counterintuitive, as the function of anarchal functions that they have normalized into their culture as status quo socially engineered customs without reason engages in the system of Jublex, which collects to itself and then collapses on itself. The amount of attention that they would have to give in order to make some variation of a pseudo actual structure as to make it look like anything in particular would functionally be against the nature of their existence as a collective, functioning, chaotic evil structure. Acidic stench ooze is functionally their core intellectual ideals, and to this extent it is counterintuitive, and thus the containment structure of the public hazard is exponentially a security risk, as it being captured by enemies of the United States would consistently be a key strategy for terrorist operations when they engage in any kind of hostile actions, such as the projected hybrid warfare, leveraging the society of anti-human systems, engaging in the function of its trained, perfected distribution as an inconsolable threat, exponentially splashing the ooze in floods, generating the sticky, corrosive consumption of the human beings caught up in the toxic hazard. A normal function of their customs for the enforcement of their illusions, as an example of the difficulty to do what it is they claim they want to do, would be similar to the function of their preferences as wizard communists to engage in the central planned economy, which includes their restraints against people's access to education, blocking the projected contract schedules for their education and the work specifically connected to it by the use of force, as clan terrorism is a common tactic, and thus the action of their active harassment in proximity to people, using various tricks in order to restrain them so that they cannot do what, legally speaking, they would commonly be able to do, and thus the action of enforcing the illusion that they cannot do it by the use of the persistent restraint mechanism generates the status quo trauma to the general system, and thus the act of the preservation of their culture of basically rapists engages in the function of the restraints, and thus the confining of the entirety of the rape culture is the concentration as a status quo obligation of generically just rapists, and thus the highly sexualized diversity of fake liberty for women by the compelling them to engage in the hypersexualization as a fake liberty, as it is the release of other restraints in order to conduct this, is a perpetuity racket for sexual abuse, which has been done, but then would be concentrated exclusively to the area, and thus the self-contradiction to the function generates moral quandaries that specifically my liberal friends would not specifically know how to deal with in a qualified manner, as the definition of doing it is in a validation of one of these moral violations, and the act of stopping it is an act of genocide, as that is their social identity. Now, again, David's liberal friends will have problems with this as well, and thus the action requires a self-contradictory function, as they would fundamentally be opposed to any of these continuations of those social practices, and thus the obligation of maintaining rape as a consistent advanced format for prostitution by the wizards who have engaged themselves as pimps is fundamentally non-changeable without attacking the identity of their society. And while the correction against the crimes by confining the Confederates includes the function of those of higher debts going to the bottom of society, which is what higher debts means, you still changed the structure without changing their society. But that just means there are different rapists doing the exact same thing. And so your pseudo intellectual position of flawed logic superimposes a rationality that cannot, by definition, work, and thus the existence of churning the ooze is still going to have an aesthetic sewage stench. It's still just ooze. No matter how you paint the lipstick on the pig, a Confederate is a Confederate. White trash who can't pay for things and so steals by armed robbery, terrorism, and other subversions and various artifices generates the perpetuity of their core identity, and there really isn't a way of doing it properly. You can't do all of the contradictory things as they are fundamentally contradictory. Their purpose is to infiltrate and compromise a host to be infected by them, the parasite. It, by definition, requires the actions of these contradictions, which only works as they, having engaged with another system, are not functionally the other system, and thus creates a self-contradictory oxymoron as a status quo, which is going to be very difficult for them to overcome. I might have dragged it on a little bit too long, but functionally, the fact of not committing the genocide requires the sustaining of the structure by the anarchists, but the act of sustaining it requires it to be done by an outside force. But that outside force would become the new rape culture, and thus the action perpetrates unto itself, and thus similar to in the function of D&D, of the creation of the nine hells in order to fight the demonic realm, you would actively be deforming yourself to have supported creating the system, and thus, even if you were the most beautiful angel in all of the heavens, this would still fundamentally corrupt your adorable aesthetic. Jumping in and swimming through the sewers in order to clean up the sewers as a function of the sewers is a nasty business.